What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Existential Stoic Podcast, episode 47. We've made it to 47. I'm Randy. That's my buddy, Danny. And today we're talking about questions that will change your life. That's right, you.
Ooh,
And your
you.
life. Questions that will change your life. First question is, what are we going to be talking about today?
Yeah, it's a good point, right?
But we already answered that.
We
Yeah.
did. We're talking about questions that'll change your life, and I would like to say, "What's up, buddy?"
That's question number two.
Right?
Yeah.
When I suggested this, I was really thinking about you know, I was thinking about all these. We talk about existentialism sometimes, and we talk about stoicism sometimes. We talk about philosophy in general sometimes. And I was thinking, all these great thinkers over the years, Socrates famously said, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? The life in which the way to interpret that is the life without self-examination or without examining the world, without asking questions, is not a worthwhile life. And I think that's, it's something we don't often think about, the importance of questions and why they matter and what they do for us, the way they make us. I think questioning is a way to stay engaged in the world, in your life. It's a way to take control of your life. It's a way to understand the world around you, to make sense of it. But it's also a way to recognize, it's also admitting that you don't know everything. It's also admitting, by asking questions, you're also admitting that you don't have some special status or special position on the truth, right? And I think that's also important.
That's a great point. Because Socrates, arguably one of the most intelligent people of all time, he's famous for saying, all that I know is that I know nothing.
Yeah.
So
one of the foundational fathers of Western philosophy, literally. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And his whole method, the Socratic method, based on asking questions. And even
go ahead.
So even like a modern day person who's big on questions, Tony Robbins all the time says that, your life is based on the better questions you have, the better life you're going to have. So it's all about asking the best questions, because then the supercomputer between your two ears will be able to answer those questions.
And you know what else too? I think on top of that, like going on, you said, Socrates said, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Like, it's funny that the people you meet, the smarter they are, the more they question the world, the more they also admit how little we know about the world, about ourselves. And that's the whole point. If there's any point to living, it's trying to understand ourselves, understand this, and live the best we can. And I think the other side of this too is, the questions that will change your life. The other important part of this, I think, this sort of puzzle, is the fact that, of not being afraid to ask questions. And what I mean by that too is not being afraid to ask difficult questions, not being afraid to ask questions of others, just to ask. Sometimes, you might be really good at something, or there might be things you could do, but if you don't ask to get the opportunity, to get the chance, it'll never happen.
Ask and it shall be given you.
Yes,
definitely. Yeah, and I mean, what you were talking about there, when you were talking about questions initially for the topic of the episode, I was thinking of the Oracle of Delphi. So, know thyself. And, oftentimes in order to know yourself, you have to ask, who am I? What's important to me? And all of these questions. So we can talk about all of that stuff too. It's going to be a great episode. I'm excited.
It is. One of my favorite philosophers, actually, of the ancients, was one of the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus. And he actually said, I sought myself. And I always love that, the idea that, you can, just through seeking yourself, asking questions, self-reflection, self-awareness, right? You can come to know the world, and you can also live the best life possible. But it requires first asking questions, asking the right questions, and learning to be a questioner,
First you say ask, then you say seek. Next you're going to say knock, because it's like asking and shall be given, seek and you shall find, knock and you shall. Yeah. Anyways,
we got to get there. We got to get to all of them.
Absolutely. So, in terms of asking questions, I also really like what you put where you said, don't be afraid to look stupid, to not know the answer. Because I think this is one of the most important things. We learn we learn from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment and from looking
Yeah.
like a fool and looking like an idiot and just, you know, keeping at it. And I see that so often where like everybody is a perfectionist. They're so afraid. Like, okay, point in case. There's this guy I know who speaks 5 languages. Okay. Somebody
Okay.
and you learn to speak languages by blundering. Like you just
Yeah.
mess up enough times until you get it. But he speaks 5 languages. Okay. Somebody asked him to speak one of the languages and he was shy about speaking it. And I was like, how is that possible? How is that possible? Who cares? Because I think it was because he was like the teacher. So like he felt, like people were going to
Oh,
judge him. But even so, it's like this whole thing that people have about looking stupid. Like it must have been in school where people were just like so
well,
humiliated for looking stupid.
I am so glad you brought that up actually, because it's like there was some really important studies that were done that showed one, um, especially I'm thinking here of the US, but particularly women, young women especially, are less likely to raise their hand in class and answer a question unless they're 100% sure they know the answer, because they're so afraid of being embarrassed, of the social pressure to be perfect, all of that. Um, so it means the consequences are that the men are more likely to raise their hands even if they don't know. And right there, that shows you some problems in how we're educating individuals. But, generally speaking, in a class, when you're teaching people, you can see it, like people want to ask things. And I always tell my classes, like, just ask whatever question is, just ask it, because chances are somebody else in the room has the same question or something related. Because if
Yeah.
you're not getting it, they're probably not getting it. And
And
if no one asks,
everybody's like it's a stupid question. And then
yeah.
there's no stupid question. And it's like, yeah, the stupid question is the one that you want to ask and you don't. That's the
And
stupid question. And now
yeah,
you're stupid because you're stuck with it.
yeah, you're stupid because you didn't ask. And the worst part is too, is like, if you're instructing people, you can sometimes see that they're not getting it or that they have questions. But until they ask, you don't know exactly what it is. And if you've studied something for a long time or worked on something for a long time, it is hard to mentally get back to that place you were in when you first interacted with it and those questions that you had. It's not always easy to remember, what were my initial questions? What were my initial struggles? Because that's helpful information, obviously, used to help them sort of understand it and know. So it's like, yeah, not being afraid to just ask is the starting point. I think you have
Well,
to
you
get
you
over
made
that.
a really good point right there. I remember a story that you were telling about one of your professors early on, and you were talking about how he knew so much, and he kind of told you it's like because I've been doing this for a long time,
Yeah.
and it's
Oh
like,
yeah.
yeah. And like
He was great.
nowadays,
Yeah.
yeah. So like
Yeah. I was gonna.
nowadays,
Okay.
because we have, let me just finish this and then we'll come back to that. So like
Yeah.
nowadays, there are so many examples of these people who have been working on stuff forever and now they're an expert. And because you see them all over the place being an expert, you think that they're an expert at everything. So like, you know, but like the thing is, they've spent so much time. So tell that story for maybe people who haven't heard it that first time, because this is like it's a phenomenal story.
Yeah. No, it was good. It was. I was studying philosophy in undergrad. I had this great advisor who was like, at the time, he had to have been in his late 60s, right? So, I'm what, like 21 or 2. So he's got, roughly 40 years on me. And he just seemed to know everything. And the guy he was very brilliant, practicing Buddhist and all, very nice, very, very mild mannered, very nice guy, very helpful, awesome. And like, I would get frustrated because I'd be like, man, like, I'm never going to be able to do this like you do it. And like, I went to his office one time because I was working on my thesis project, and I said something to him like, like, it's like, you get it so easy. I'm never going to be able to do this. And he's like, he stopped me. He's like, stop. He's like, calm down. He's like, I have 40 years, at least on you. At least. That's 4 decades. He's like, so think about how much you read now. He's like, forget about what I've read. He's like, just think about how much you read now. If you read the same amount as you do now for 40 years in one subject area, he's like, you're definitely gonna be fine. He's like, you'll definitely know enough. And it's like, and it just put it into perspective so clearly. And it's funny too that you were mentioning that, because it made me think of something else as well. And it's a common mistake. I remember when I was doing my student teaching, as a teaching, when you're learning how to teach, I guess in graduate school, you're a teacher's assistant, and then you teach classes on your own. And one of the best things, one of the faculty members asked me is like, what do you do if you get a question that you don't know the answer to? Because like a lot of people think, I'm in the front of the room, I'm teaching this class, I should know the answer to everything. That is absurd. Because first of all, you have kids from all different backgrounds. Some of them are very intelligent, and some of them are very intelligent in different fields. So they might make a connection. Somebody might make a connection to say scientific implication for something in philosophy, and they know the science better than I do. Now, I can talk out my ass and pretend like I know something, right? And know the answer, but it's better just to admit that, hey, I don't know. It's okay. I can look it up for you. I can definitely look into it. And that's what I said. I said I would take my time and I would think. And if I couldn't answer it, I'd just tell them. And then I'd say, look, I can look into it and get back to you because that's the reality. But, it's like, it's not just asking questions, it's also understanding how to respond, I think, to questions when asked. And like to that, even the people that we look up to as experts and stuff, they don't have all the answers either. I think that's crucial as well.
And so I'm listening to this book about Charlie Munger right now because he's like arguably one of the more intelligent people living right now. People love him for his mental models and his ability to just like think of everything all at
People
once.
do
So
love him. Yeah.
yeah. And so like one of the things that he talks about there is how when you're an expert in only one thing, you're actually very, very dangerous
Yeah.
because you see the world from only one point of view. And he talks about all the time how you need to have this broad scope of knowledge. So I think that like everybody gets paralyzed from these people who are really good at one thing. And usually that one thing is just making money. And we
Yeah.
think that we idolize them because they've become good at this one thing called making money. And really, we don't see the potential damage that that's causing just
Oh,
because
dude.
they literally can be a weapon.
We were, I think I mentioned this before, Nietzsche did this lecture series called Anti-Education, and he was critiquing the education system in Germany at the time for what he saw as, basically it was going in the wrong direction. And there's like, look, he was like, elitist and snobbish, and there's a lot of issues with it. But a lot of the criticisms he made were very important, which was he was saying that, basically the education system was starting to, much like it does now, focus on specialization, focus on work preparation. So instead of educating people to be well-rounded individuals, to be good persons, to be good members of society, to have broad knowledge, they were really educating people to do one specific thing. And he said the problem with that is then you rely on the newspaper, because that was the time, obviously, right? So you're relying on the newspaper for all your information about all these things that are happening in the world, but you don't have the skill set to process it, to understand it, to make informed judgments. And so you end up, basically being stupid in all these other areas because you haven't ever explored them and you haven't developed as a whole person. And I think this is the other important thing about asking questions. It's about becoming a whole person. It's about having broad knowledge. It's about always learning. And it's about becoming becoming your best self, a good person, not just good at something. And there's a difference.
That's a really good point. So that being what it is, what are some good questions that people would be asking? Questions that can change your life. What?
Oh, is that the topic?
Yeah,
No, we're just talking about
definitely.
questions in general. No. Um,
Yeah.
Man, we go off
So
topic so fast.
I
We don't.
remember I remember back in high school we used to play the question game. Uh, and it starts something along the lines of, "Do you want to play the question game?" Oh, what's the question game? Yeah,
Keep going.
So, anyways, do you have any
Questions that'll
ideas
change
for
it.
some life changing questions? I have a couple. If you want, I'll
Uh,
go first.
I have a few too. You go first. I'll follow. It's fine. That's good.
Okay, so I think one important question is, who am I? Certainly.
Yeah.
And
I
I,
don't
and
know.
I don't think that necessarily you're going to get an answer. Like, I think a lot of the most important questions, there may not be a definitive answer, or it may be a
Actually,
temporary answer.
I really like that you said that actually, because I think most of the most important questions I think in life, I was just talking to I just finished teaching a class on ethics right now. And I said to him, I said, look, this was a 6-week class on introduction to ethics. This is not representative of the whole field. I was like, we've been doing ethics at least for 2,500 years and probably way longer in human society, right? So it's like, and we still argue about a lot of the same things. And I think that's what's important. It's not necessarily always getting an answer or getting a definitive answer that matters. It's that you're asking, and that asking implies searching, exploring, and learning. That's what matters, right? And I think I'm glad you brought that up, because like, especially with questions like, who am I? Well, the answer now might be different than you would have answered 5 years ago or even a month ago. And it might be different, how you answer that in a year. But by asking it and continually asking it, you're constantly sort of ensuring that you're on the right direction path, in the right direction, right? That you're doing what's right for you.
Yeah. And so like I look at that question, and the way that I like to answer, and I don't know, maybe we'll go into kind of how we answer these things. It could be helpful for people. So like I like to answer it in an empowering way. So like when I ask myself, who am I? Sure, there are things about me that aren't great, but I don't focus on that stuff. Like I focus on the possibility that I have and the things that I can accomplish and the things that I'm working on and things that I want in my life. So like that's one thing. And then also with that question, I kind of look at it like, what do I find valuable? What's valuable to me? What are my values? Because that also really helps define me. And it's something that I figured out just in the past couple of years. So like this is something that is brand new to me, but it's like actually finding that stuff that's unique to me, that like, other people may mock me for it, but I love doing it. That's the type of stuff that when I spend my time doing that, it's like, time just disappears.
Yeah. Well, that's, I think you raised two such good ones there. Like, what do I value? What matters to me is probably one of the most important questions we can ask, because it's, if we understand our values, not only can, and I mean our values broadly construed, not only do we identify the things that we like doing and what's important to us, but we also identify what really matters to us in this world. And that is so important to understand, because if you don't answer these questions for yourself, the other problem is that they will be answered for you, either by circumstances, by other people, by social pressures, by expectations. There's a lot of forces essentially in the world providing meaning, and you need to make it yourself, or it will be provided for you. And I really think that's, what you value is crucial. What matters to you is such an important question to understand, for self-understanding, and you're really like, self-awareness in the first place. And I think I would add to that too. If I can add, one of my questions is, that I've been thinking about a lot recently is, I like asking it in the sense of like, what is a good person? What is a good life? And what does it look like? And I like phrasing it that way, because when I ask, like, what is a good person? Or I ask, what is a good life? I imagine all these things that might contribute to it, or it might, but then when I ask, what does it look like? I'm asking myself, what does that mean for me realizing it in the world? What would I look like? What would my life look like if I was a good person in my ideal sense, or if I was, living the exact life that I want? And when I do that, that visualization helps me start to understand, again, my values, how I can plan projects, all this stuff that's so important to living the life you want.
That is brilliant, because that takes it from kind of a theoretical type of thing to a practical, this is exactly what you do. And then once you start doing that stuff, because once you take it out of the theoretical and you put it into the practical, actionable, and you start doing that, then you become the type of person who does that. And then you become that theoretical idea you have. So like, that's an absolutely brilliant way to look at it.
Well, it's funny. I started thinking that way because, when you look at all these like ideas or examples of good people from the past, and like in ethics and stuff, or like, you look at the Stoic, like the exemplary individual and stuff, it's like the exemplary individual was that they were an example, right? And I think it's important to think of that. So like, when you ask these questions for yourself, if you're not sure, I think it's also asking yourself then, like, well, who are my models? Who are my role models? Who do I admire? And asking yourself, why do I admire them? That can help you identify your values. That can help you identify the kind of life you want to live. And I think, when we start to understand these things, it's like we're really examining our life in critical ways that are important. but we're also, like you just said, and that's the crucial thing is there is a difference between in theory and in practice, right? Like, we all might have an idea of what a good person looks like, or we all might have an idea, but it's like, one, is it really my idea of a good person? And two, do I even know what the hell it means to do that, to make that a reality? And do my beliefs, do my values, are they sort of, are they exhibited in the world through my action?
Yeah, because there's a huge difference between like, some people live their whole life in this fantasy world. And then, but it's like to know and not to do is not yet to know. So like, and this is something that like I think separates. I think it really does separate the successes from the aspirationals, the people who just want to be,
Oh yeah.
because it's it's really not that hard. Like everyone who's a success, they're on the whole, they're no smarter than you are. They're no luckier than you are. It's just they actually did it and they just
Yeah.
took the action. Like I remember for so long, whenever I would read books, they some books have like action steps in them. And I would always be like, oh yeah, I'll come back and I'll do this later. And and I would never ever go back to the book and do it. So now, like, whenever that stuff comes up in a book, I just start doing it now because I'm reading through the book anyways. And it
Yeah.
makes such a big difference because you actually like put it into practice, like what you're saying.
Yeah, you're putting it into practice, and you're actually, and also I think what people forget too is when you put it into practice, by doing that, it also allows you to formulate new other important questions. Questions that you would never have thought of had you not tried, you know. And it's also like I think importantly too, when we talk about questions that will change your life, it's also how do we phrase these questions? How when you the way you phrase a question is also, I think, indicative of whether or not it's a serious question or whether or not it'll get you to where you want to go or whether or not you're thinking practically. I think there's so many things here that are important that can help us really, like, not only understand our lives but live a better life.
I
And
want
then,
to I want to
yeah, go ahead.
I want to continue what you were just saying there with phrasing the question, how that is extremely important. So I read about this the first time from Rich Dad Poor Dad, where he's like, many people say
Oh
I
yeah.
can't afford it, and he says rich people say, how can I afford it? And there's so many books that basically say that if you just analyze the words that come out of your mouth, it'll tell you a lot about your life. So by asking it like that, by using the phrasing like you're talking about to figure it out, that gives you so much leeway. Like instead of saying, oh, I can't afford it, say, how can I afford it? Or instead of saying like, oh, I'm so unsociable, you could be like, how can I be sociable? So it's like all of these things that the phrasing of the question definitely makes a big difference.
Oh yeah, and like, and especially instances too where, like, when you examine the types of questions you ask and the types and the ways you phrase it, it also kind of informs you, are you treating yourself as a victim or as somebody who has agency? Because, like, a lot of times when you tell yourself, like, oh, you run into an obstacle and you say, I can't do that, and somebody says why, then your response, right? Or if you ask yourself, well, why can't I do it? And you think about your response and how you phrase it. Is it because you're blaming something in the world outside? Are you really trying to take responsibility away from yourself because you're afraid of change, or because you're putting self-imposed limitations on yourself, or self-imposed, whatever? Or is it that there is some physical barrier that's actually blocking you? And then if that's the case, how can I overcome it? That's the question, right? How can I move past it? Because if I really want that thing, those are the questions you need to ask, and that's the phrasing you need to use. It needs to be said in the positive, actionable, where you're recognizing your agency and your responsibility in the matter.
Yeah, and that should be like a red flag for people. If you hear yourself saying I can't
Yeah,
often, you
yeah.
really need to start looking at, you know, what's going on there. Can you actually do it? And why are you saying I can't?
I'm glad you actually mentioned that too, because one of my favorite questions too is whenever I'm facing something that I want to do or I want to try, and I one of the things I first ask myself is, do other people do this? Because then if they do, I know I can do it. And if they're doing it, I ask, how did they do it? because those are two important things. The recognition that if somebody else is doing it, you can definitely do it because pretty much we can all do almost the same amount of stuff. It's just putting the time in and the effort in. And two, you're asking that how. So, that gets you to the planning stage and it gets you some sort of goals and stuff so you can start working towards it. And I think that recognition, though, because we love to think, and it must come from school or something, that teaching, that you're a failure if you don't succeed immediately, teaching people if you're not in the top, 5%, you're not going to do well, or it's not worth even bothering. That mentality is so toxic. And I think when you start looking at the world and you realize, hey, dude, if somebody else can do it, I can totally do it. It's not that hard. It's just a matter of figuring it out. It might take some legwork, it might take some stuff, but then you at least know that it's possible. You recognize that it's possible because you're a human being.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of in that same vein, a daily question that I like to ask myself when I'm journaling is how can I do better?
Oh, I like
So
that. Yeah.
yeah, so this is one I got from the Magic of Thinking Big, and it's a very open-ended question because even though it's the same question every day, the answers will be like whoo all over the place because it basically like each day it kind of takes a look at the things that are on my mind that day or the things that are bothering me or whatever it may be. And I'm able to look at that area and how can I do better? And by writing it down, that's not solving it, but by writing it down, that like puts it into my life where already it's getting acted on because I've questioned it and because I've written it down.
I think one of the things you said there is probably one of the most important things, especially when you're journaling and stuff. And if you're trying to figure out yourself, your life, one of the best things to do is ask open-ended questions. And people think questions have to be these specific things with a direct answer, but a lot of the greatest questions don't have answers, not immediately apparent ones, or the answer is plastic. It might change in circumstances. And I think the other important thing too is, when you ask open-ended questions like that, you realize that you start answering them differently. It gets you to think differently. It changes your perspective, and it makes you better equipped to ask other difficult questions later. And with that, I think, too, I wanted to add, like, asking yourself difficult questions is also really important. Like, if like that was one thing I started doing when I realized like I was in a situation I didn't want to be in. My life wasn't going the way I wanted to go. I started to seriously ask myself, like, what is going wrong? Why does this keep happening? And started to look at it like, in the sense of like, it is my fault. Some of this has to be my fault. So what am I doing wrong? How have I essentially failed myself? And how can I get past this? How can I get beyond it? How can I overcome these barriers?
Yeah. And that's I mean, what was it like to sit with those difficult questions? Because those are really kind of soul searching questions you're asking.
I mean, it's hard. And we talked about this before too. I think sometimes, it's one of the challenges is sometimes like it was sitting with it for weeks, sometimes more. In some cases, literally over a year, sitting with these questions and working through them in my journal, like over and over again. But, I was seeing progress. Don't get me wrong. And I want to point that out. I think as soon as I started it, I started to work through it. But I could tell looking back, I could see myself wavering, going back and forth sometimes between the old me and the person I wanted to be. And like, but by continually sticking with it, by continually asking it, I got beyond it. And I think it is difficult. It's very hard. It can be upsetting. It can be, but it's also that's how we work through things. And I think people forget that too. Like asking questions and asking the right questions is one of the best ways to work through the problems in our lives, to work through our mental problems, I mean, everything. We have to ask first to get beyond where we are now, right? To see change, we have to first identify what's wrong. We have to first identify how to overcome it. We have to identify the obstacle. You have to plan. It's all questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I really admire about you is how you're willing to sit with something until. So like you talk about that with the difficult questions you've had to answer. You talked about that with starting your blog as well. How you stick with it. Like it's not easy. It takes longer than you want and you just stick with it. And that persistence, that grit, that stickiness, like I really admire that because that's something like if you stick with it, you get through it. And that's such an awesome quality to have and to emulate.
Oh, thanks. And it is. It sucks though. It does suck sometimes. It's hard. But I think the other thing to keep in mind too is like, yes, it'll be difficult now, but as long as you stick with it, you know it'll get done too, though. And that's the other thing. It's like it's sometimes I think too, it's those important questions. Like you mentioned, I think if people have listened to the quick fix this week, the idea that you mentioned before too about prioritization, right? Asking yourself what's important, what belongs in category A, what belongs in category B, what belongs in category C, right? And category A is going to be the most important stuff, the priority, but it's also going to be the difficult stuff. It's going to be the stuff that's probably going to be hardest. It's going to be the stuff you have to sit with. But when you start to ask these kinds of questions, you're also fundamentally asking, I think, what matters to me? What do I really, and I think, what do I want to make of this life? And I think that's on that note, that's another, questions that will change your life is this the person I want to be? Is a good question. And, if I know that if I assume that I only have this one life, am I living this one life in the way that is right for me? I think those kinds of questions that include a recognition of our mortality, that we have a limited amount of time, are also important.
I was just going to bring that up. So one of the questions that I ask myself pretty regularly is, if I only had 6 months left to live, what would I change about my life? Because
I like that.
Everybody lives like we got a million years to live, And the thing is, you're here today, you're gone today. You never know what it's going to be. I mean, life expectancy goes up and up, and there's a good chance that you'll live a nice full life, but it's not guaranteed. So why are you putting off the life that you want? When do you think it's going to happen? If not now, then when? So like that's a question that I like to ask all the time. Like, if you and I think that 6 months is a great time period, because it's like long enough to really make a big difference, but at the same time it's short enough where it's like what 6 months feels like.
Yeah, I really like that, because it's an amount of time we can comprehend and conceptualize. But I also really like it too, because one, if you're living the life that's right for you, the life that's meant for you, right, you probably wouldn't change anything. But then there's also, like, I know so many people who, like, I've always wanted to travel to this place, this one specific place. It's like, well, if you only had 6 months to live, you should probably go there, right? Like, if you knew you were going to die in 6 months, now's the time to do it, if that's like that important to you. And it's like, thinking that way, I think, is critical too, because it helps us ask those hard questions and get to the bottom of difficult questions about what really matters. And it teaches us, I think, too, by asking questions like this, it teaches us also how to say yes and no and to the appropriate things. Because we've talked about it so many times, but I think, at bottom, questioning the examined life, it's worthwhile because it is your own life. It's a life where you have your own values, your own priorities. It's yours. And you have to ask the questions to get to that point. And I think that's why it's so important, at least in my mind. That's why it's so important. It's so critical.
Yeah, definitely. And I have another question that comes up. It's you know what? It's gone.
That's okay. You know, I always like to what was it? It was Sartre always had that idea of, that human beings we have radical freedom, and with radical freedom comes radical responsibility, right? And I think I always like thinking in those terms too, that, part of living life, and this question I ask myself is, am I willing to take responsibility for this? Am I willing to take responsibility for who I am? Or am I taking responsibility for my life, right? Do I look at my life, and do I look at my past and who I am now as something that I created, that I'm accountable for? Or do I look at it as something that other people or circumstances made, where I don't bear any responsibility or any burden for? Because what I like about Sartre's conception of radical freedom and radical responsibility is, to be free, you also have to be responsible for yourself, right? In that strict sense of, you're responsible for everything you do and for what you become and for who you are.
Yeah, that's a really great one. So like one of the books I just read was on forgiveness, because I've been dealing with like some long-standing forgiveness issues. And I kind of came to this realization the other day that the reason that I'm not really forgiving the other person is because I'm not being responsible for what happened. You know, like I'm still really angry at them because of what they did, but it was because of what I did first that they did that. And so like by seeing that it's really, you know, I'm the one who's responsible at this, it gives me a little bit more leeway in being able to forgive them and to kind of write it off and move forward from it. But
You know,
it's something
okay.
that I didn't see until just then, that how much it is my responsibility, not theirs. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. And well, that's another fun, when you're struggling with interpersonal, you know, either regrets or disputes or issues with friends, family, colleagues, there is a fun thing to do, which is to ask yourself a question, and basically you try to you write it in a journal or something personal, but you try to imagine it from their perspective. What would it look like from their perspective? What does this situation look like from their perspective? What are their motives? These are great questions to ask, because it is often so easy to get caught up in our own heads that we're the subject experiencing the world and everything else is, there for us, right? And we forget that there's other people with other lives, with other lived experiences, with other personalities. And when we start to ask questions about maybe how they see things, it also is a great way to help us see ourselves differently and to help us see that, okay, yeah, we might have an issue with it, but we might have done something as well too, or they might have interpreted something we did a little weird too. And maybe it was all just a mistake, but it helps you get to the bottom of it. It also helps you be more empathetic to other people's situations and suffering and problems. And I think it's a great thing, asking, and that gets back to that broader question of, what is a good person? What do they look like? What does that person do? And I think a good person, when I ask myself that question, they're a person that's able to take account of other people's perspectives as well, not just their own, and
Yeah.
think about things in this broad way, right?
Yeah, I think that's like a next level skill, because I've heard about that so often, putting yourself in the other person's shoes, and it's something that uh, it I'm not quite there yet. Like I work at it, and like I sometimes do it, but like it's something that requires, I think, effort, or like a next level type of thing in order to be able to do that. But I'm
I
getting
think
there.
I think I think one of the best things, I'm serious, like that can help you get there is do journaling where you can write it out, and because you don't have to show it to them. Nobody else has to see it. It's just yours. And it's just a way to practice imagining. It's almost like if you were writing a story and you were doing character development, right? And you wanted to develop your character, get a sense of who they are. So you just do a little sketch or maybe a little scene, just to kind of work out their characteristics and qualities. It's kind of like that, but it's like I think by doing that, you're asking yourself to think outside of yourself for a bit, to consider other people as full people. And I think it's hard. It's not easy. I mean, most of us are not great at it because, look, from a survival perspective, this matters first, right? And this perspective matters first, from that perspective. So it makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the other thing that I was going to say was, uh, another question is, if you were starting over from zero, what habits or actions do you have that you would not start again?
Oh,
So this is like the sunk cost fallacy, where like people think that because they're already doing it, they have to continue doing it, even though they may not like it. Like a lot of people get stuck in this thing with their work, or whatever it may be. Maybe they have some habits they don't like. Which things in your life that you're doing now would you not start over again?
I like that one too, because it's a different way of asking, sort of, it's a different way of asking yourself what really matters and what you're doing, and kind of looking at yourself differently in that sense, to kind of get a handle on, what should be part of you moving forward and what shouldn't. That's a cool one. I like that a lot. I like that a
Mm-hmm.
lot. And that can be a tricky one to answer sometimes too. And I like it too because it's not about like looking back and regretting or wishing these things didn't happen. It's very forward looking, which I like, because I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot more positive when you're talking about, these sorts of things. You don't want to look back and be like regretting and negative and all, but instead, what can I do? What can I take out now? What
Yeah.
wouldn't I want?
And also it's a question that you can kind of appreciate your life. Like, let's say you don't have that many things, or maybe you don't have any things. Then you can look at that and be like, hey, I'm living the life of my dreams. Like, this is pretty awesome. And you can start to be grateful for it, that like you're actually living intentionally the life that you would want to live.
That's another good question too, actually, on that note too, is, like, what am I actually grateful for?
Mm.
And we've talked about that a ton, but like, like what in my day to day, what in my overall life, what are the things that, and I think we mentioned it in a recent episode, but like, what are those things that, if you think of it in terms of like, as our past being, the culmination of who we are now and it being necessary for who we are now, what are those things now that I really appreciate that in a way makes even the difficulties of my past worthwhile? Because I am who I am now and I have the life that I have now, or I have these very important things in my life now that if I change something in the past would be gone, right?
Yeah. I mean, it really comes down to like gratitude and optimism and perspective and patience. And it's like, if you have these qualities, you're set. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, how often are you taught that stuff in school? I mean, you studied philosophy, so you probably saw it a lot more than other people, but like, we spend so much time on like algebra and so much time on reading the Scarlet Letter and like all of these things that really are not very useful life skills.
It's so funny you bring that up because, like, I did study philosophy, but it was in college. I mean, it didn't start till it was in college because they don't teach it, otherwise in public school and stuff. And it's like, it always bothered me that we didn't teach it in public schools and like grade school and high school, at least, because it's not that it doesn't even matter whether any of these individuals are right. It's just the way of thinking about the world, the types of questions they ask, the way that teaches you to ask questions, to be critical, I think is so valuable. And it can help so much in dealing with these big life problems that we will all face.
Yeah, and just like starting to examine the good life. What is a good life?
Yeah.
Starting to examine that early on. Um, that
To even recognize that there's other possibilities, other lives other ways you could be living, other ways of valuing things. I mean, like, it's so easy when you don't have other examples to just take for granted the values that are presented to you from the world around you. And it's like, that's not it. That's not all that's there. You have to ask questions, right?
and
And those
I've seen
questions,
it firsthand. People who were like great successes in school, and then they couldn't, like, life became difficult, or they couldn't be a perfectionist in the real world, and they just like crashed. You know,
yeah, yeah,
it's yeah. So it's unfortunate.
it is.
So, any other questions that are coming to mind for you? Questions that could change your life.
That could change your life. I think there's like, I guess I would definitely add to that, I guess, like, you know, how can I phrase this? Okay, so I do think creativity and I think lifelong learning are crucial to like life in general. I think it's just being a human being, right? So I think like I don't know how to phrase the question correctly right now because it's like for some reason it's just I'm having trouble with it. But like, you know, just the question that, like the world's worth questioning, that it's worth questioning stuff, it's worth questioning just because it's like that questioning spirit of being engaged with the world. Like, hey, how's that work? Hey, what's that? I remember being younger and my parents used to get mad at me because I remember taking apart electronics because I wanted to see how it worked inside. I remember, those old cassette players. I remember taking apart because I wanted to see the little like gears and the wheels and how it spun and how it read the little thing. And like, but by taking it apart, in some cases, I ruined some things. I tried to put them back together, but I was little. And it's like that kind of like having that kind of spirit, that mindset that like life is about asking questions, I think gives you such a different engagement in your life and in the world. And I think one of the most important reasons why you should ask questions is, thinking all the answers, not examining your own life, you're not going to be a good person. And you're missing out on a lot because you assume you know things before you even try them. You assume you know that someone's good or bad before you even meet them. You assume so. And I think assumptions, what do? They make an ass out of you and they make an ass out of me. So I think, like, asking questions just in general, that spirit, that way of thinking, that lifelong engagement with living, this is your life, right? Make get the most out of it as possible because you don't know when it will end. And so I think I would end with that. I think in my
Yeah.
side at least.
Yeah. And I would say the same thing. Like the life of your dreams is out there. What are
Yeah.
you letting hold you back? And are you seriously going to let that hold you back from the life of your dreams?
Oh, and what are you afraid of, right? Like that's those two are good. Yeah.
You're gonna die. What are you
Yeah.
afraid of? Yeah.
Yeah. You have nothing to lose
Literally, what
because
have you got to lose? What have you got to lose? Yeah.
I think that's a good one, right? You have nothing. What do you have to lose? What are you afraid of? Because guess what? At the end, we're all meeting the same fate and we don't take anything with us. So those are good ones. Yeah. I like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today for episode 47 of the Existential Stoic
Woo!
podcast. It's been a blast. Questions that will change your life. Danny, I
It
got to
has
say,
been
it
a
was a
blast.
pleasure.
It's always a pleasure, Randy. I love you, buddy.
I love you too. Make sure to subscribe, like, click the notification bell, share with friends and family. Come watch us on YouTube podcasts, and find Danny on Twitter. We'll catch you guys
Yeah.
later. See you next time. Peace.
Peace.